Tonight's subject is the Galilee Basin, disastrous for the environment and the Great Barrier Reef, which will prevail. Clive Palmer and his mates or the mass activist mobilisation. We have two speakers here tonight who will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes each. Then there will be a short break, and after that will be the question and answers. During the break there will be a collection and you can get some drinks as well. We have two young and I think very exciting speakers here tonight. Nicola Casiu was not able to come because he's not well, and Jess Panegyres is going to speak instead of him, and she is also a climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace. Ella Weisbrot is a national campaigner at the Australian Youth and Climate Coalition. Ella will be speaking first. She is a member of the largest youth-led organisation in Australia and one of Australia's largest climate organisations. She's been involved in the Galilee Basin campaign for almost 2 years. She began volunteering with AYCC in 2013 and was the New South Wales State Coordinator last year before becoming the national campaigner in January of this year. AYCC's mission is to build a generation-wide movement of young people to solve the climate crisis before it's too late. Ella is passionate about social justice and believes that the climate crisis is the most critical social justice issue we face at this time. Before working for AYCC, Ella worked for the Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience and as a field organiser on the 2012 Obama re-election campaign.
Thanks. So I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal people in the room today. And I think it's particularly important when we talk about issues like mining and environmental protection and climate change that we acknowledge that we're meeting today on stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded. The topic that I was asked to speak on tonight, as Mary just told you, is Galilee Basin, disastrous for the environment and the Great Barrier Reef. The fight around the Galilee Basin is at the forefront of a fight that's currently playing out around Australia and around the world between people and the fossil fuel industry. And unfortunately, right now in Australia, that also means between people and our government. But before I get into talking about the potential devastation that is opening up the Galilee Basin, I want to say that it's not all bad, far from it. Jess and I actually had a quick chat this morning on the phone when, with less than 24 hours notice, Jess was pulled into doing this speech. And mostly we just talked about how amazing it is that we seem to be facing a moment where the power really seems to be turning. And finally it seems like we are seeing power tip to the side of the people over the mining companies. And so to the second question I was asked, which will prevail, mining magnates and their mates or mass activist mobilisation, right now it's actually looking pretty good for the latter. In fact, we've already seen considerable triumph of people power. And while the fight is far from over, the Galilee fight is also demonstrating just how much power we do have when people around the country and around the world stand up and demand to have their voices heard. I should probably start by telling you a little bit about myself. As Mary said, I'm the national campaigner for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, the AYCC, and I've been involved in the REEF and Galilee campaign for almost 2 years. The Galilee Basin is actually the reason that I joined the AYCC. Before I heard about the Galilee Basin, I was involved with a number of other social justice organisations, and I thought that climate change wasn't my issue. But when I heard about the role that Australia was going to play in driving catastrophic climate change with these new mines, I knew that it had to become my issue. 2 years ago, when I first heard about the Galilee Basin, we were facing a situation of terrifying scale and potential damage. The Galilee Basin is the largest coal reserve in the world, and if it were a country, it would be the 7th largest polluter, and we'd just be adding that right on top of all the big polluters we already have. In addition to that, Australia is one of the largest coal exporters in the world. I think we're the 2nd largest, and the Galilee Basin alone would double our coal exports. And this at a time when I hope, as everybody in the room knows, we really need to be moving away from fossil fuels like coal. But in addition to this, the coal would devastate our Great Barrier Reef. both from the carbon pollution and from the ports that are required to ship the coal, which were proposed to be built in the Great Barrier Reef. The science is very clear on this one. If we want to avoid dangerous global warming, the coal in the Galilee Basin must stay in the ground. To a young person such as myself, who's never lived in a month of below average global temperatures, in fact we haven't had one in 29 years, seeing extreme weather events become more frequent and more dangerous in my own country and around the world, knowing that the most vulnerable people are already suffering first and worst from the impacts of climate change, and looking at a global economy where the coal price is in free fall, these projects make no sense whatsoever. Unfortunately, the government and business were not taking the same view. In fact, they were actively working together to unleash this coal. When I first learned about the situation, we were facing proposals for 9 new megamines and 6 coal ports, all in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. To be honest, the situation seemed pretty hopeless to me. We don't have a great track record of stopping new coal mines in Australia, unfortunately. But the potential scale of the damage from these developments is immense, and so I got involved, if only to say that I had tried. Local communities along the reef coast, from Keppel Bay to the Whitsundays, mobilised into powerful community groups, and several larger climate organisations and environmental organisations like the AYCC and Greenpeace joined the fight. Fast forward to today, I think that Jess is going to tell you a little bit more about what happened in that period, but fast forward to today and the map looks very different. 7 of the 9 mines are conclusively off the table, with the final 2 mines, I'll get into more details of that, but with the final 2 mines, China Stone and Carmichael, and the final coal port, Abbott Point, with virtually no chance of getting financed. To tell the amazing stories of all of these mines and ports would take much longer than I have this evening, so I'm going to focus on our campaign at the AYCC, the campaign to stop Abbott Point and the Carmichael mine, the one that just keeps hanging on with the support of our state, of the Queensland and federal government. In February of 2013, the AYCC launched our Climate Game Change campaign, working with young people around Australia and local communities in Queensland to help build a movement around protecting the reef and our climate. From here, we turned our attention to the Carmichael mine and Abbott Point. We decided that the best point of intervention for these developments was to stop the Abbott Point coal port and the rail lines from being built and financed. Without infrastructure, there can be no mine, and without funding, there can be no infrastructure. And so we launched our Lend-Lease campaign. In 2013, the company proposing to build the APX terminal, the largest proposed terminal on the reef, was Lend-Lease, an Australian company and a proud world leader in sustainability. At the AYCC, we thought these things didn't quite stack up, and so we decided to take the campaign straight to Lend-Lease and ask them, as young people, to stand up for our future and pull out of building the projects. In October, we launched a petition with the Sum of Us that attracted 150,000 signatures, and then we took the message directly to their door. We held a beach party outside their AGM, and we talked to shareholders as they entered about our concerns. And then we stood outside their headquarters in Sydney regularly before work and at lunchtime and talked to staff about the impact of the proposal. I was one of those volunteers. At the time I was a volunteer, and it's around the time that I got really heavily involved in the campaign. And so I stood outside the AGM and I stood outside the headquarters, often in one of our infamous Nemo costumes, and I spoke to so many staff and shareholders. And really, most of the time, it was really hard to know if we were making any difference at all. We were literally just talking to people. It didn't feel very dramatic. But in February, less than 2 weeks after I'd spent my Valentine's Day morning handing roses to staff and asking them to be the one for the reef, Lend-Lease announced that they'd withdrawn their funding from the project. Thank you. It was an incredible moment. 2 days later, with a team of volunteers, I handed thank you cards and chocolate fish to staff and senior management. And around the country, AYCC volunteers realised just how much power organised young people can have in the face of a seemingly insurmountable wall of money and power. Despite the cheering that swept AYCC offices around the country, we knew that actually the fight was far from over. There were still a few large international companies with proposals to build coal ports on the reef. And even as international banks like HSBC and Deutsche Bank announced that they would not fund any developments on the reef off the back of Lend-Lease and then Anglo-American pulling out, Australian banks were still conspicuously silent on the issue. So we decided to take on something much bigger. We started a campaign asking Australia's big four banks, that's the Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, Westpac and NAB, to publicly rule out financing Abbott Point and Galilee Basin developments. We officially launched our Don't Risk the Reef campaign in July of last year. We decided to approach Westpac first, another company that takes pride in its reputation for sustainability. When we started the campaign, Westpac had actually just won an award as the most sustainable business in the world. It's a real award, we checked. So we thought that Westpac could be the bank to show leadership and be the first Australian Big Four bank to officially publicly rule out this project. We employed a lot of similar tactics to what we did with Lend-Lease. So we stood outside their HQ and their AGM, and hundreds of young volunteers spoke to staff in branches around the country about the project. At one point, I was outside their HQ every single day for 2 weeks. There's a lot of staff in that office now who recognise and don't necessarily love the sight of my face. And we collected the voices of over 5,000, mostly customers and other Australians, asking Westpac to make this statement. Internally, in private meetings, they told us that they were unlikely to fund a project with poor environmental credentials, but they wouldn't give us any kind of assurance on this project. So we decided to take the campaign to all four banks, looking for an Australian leader and trying to make sure that nobody could slip under the radar with financing this project. Our volunteers collected 15,000 postcards with personal messages to the CEOs of all four banks asking them not to make this investment. Still, we heard no public statements. And so we decided that we needed the campaign to step it up a notch. We joined campaigns calling for divestment from organisations such as 350.org and Market Forces and launched a campaign called Dump My Bank, where we signed up customers of the big four banks to break up with their bank over this issue and move their money to one of the smaller Australian banks that don't invest in fossil fuels. We also did banner drops at their offices and talked to potential new graduates at their graduate recruitment events. On top of this, our volunteers launched a series of powerful actions attacking the brands of the big four banks. One Sunday night earlier this year, in March, late at night in every major city in the country, hundreds of volunteers hit the streets in Nemo masks, covering every CBD in posters, stickers, chalk and spray chalk, and we gave the big four bank ATMs a little improvement in truthfulness. We covered the screens in a plastic skin, customised for each bank to look like the real skin of the ATM with their branding, asking customers if they wanted their bank to use their savings to wreck the reef for a new coal port, fuel dangerous climate change, or do the right thing and rule out investing in reef destruction, with the hashtag #DumpMyBank. All four banks called us before 9 a.m. on Monday morning. They were really starting to get nervous because we were clearly stepping up our campaign, but still no bank would come forward and rule out the project. It wasn't good enough. As Australian banks continued to show no leadership, the movement was actually continuing to grow overseas, and the largest international investment banks continued to rule out investing in these projects, thanks to organisations like Greenpeace. So banks like Citibank, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland, bringing the total to 11 out of the 20 biggest investment banks in the world, saying they'd put no finance towards these projects. On top of this, the Australian Financial Review had announced at the end of last year that the Commonwealth Bank was advising Adani, the company now building the port and mine, on the financing of the project. We asked them publicly and in private meetings if this was true. Repeatedly, they refused to confirm or deny. We started to get reports that the project was progressing through the various layers of Commonwealth Bank project finance. It looked like they were seriously considering the investment. In February, at our National Volunteer Summit, over 280 young people had held a Valentine's Day rally on the steps of the Commonwealth Bank headquarters in Sydney, performing our own version of Stop in the Name of Love, complete with singing Nemos and speakers from the Pacific Islands and the Reef Coast, all calling on the Commonwealth Bank not to make this investment. As the other banks looked less and less likely to invest, it became clear that we needed to give our full attention and the full campaign enthusiasm of our volunteers to the Commonwealth Bank. In Sydney, we talked to staff at their headquarters every week, giving out a new flyer each week with updates on the landscape. Evidence from the Queensland Land Court that Adani was lying about the job figures. Evidence that Queensland's own Treasury had advised the state government that the project was unbankable. A 16-year-old Commonwealth Bank Dolomite, Naomi, also launched her own petition, calling on the CEO, Ian Narev, to rule out financing Abbott Point. And she got 10,000 signatures. And then the 16-year-old went to a packed business lunch full of Ian Narev's peers and stood up and asked him if he would rule out making the investment. His answer to her was that it was complicated. We actually thought the choice was pretty clear. We held a queue-in at a branch in Sydney with 100 volunteers, many of whom closed their account on the spot. Our volunteers also visited well over 200 branches around the country and gave out a survey to staff, an anonymous staff survey, where they could tell their management how they felt about the project. And no surprises, 73% of staff asked that CommBank, their employer, not fund the project. In the comments on the survey, a number of staff said that if CommBank were to invest, they would quit. Organisations such as 350.org had also turned their full attention to CommBank, who were holding powerful actions like sit-ins around the country. In early August, so just a few weeks ago, our volunteers were gearing up to kick off our biggest few weeks yet. We were launching a full-on brand attack. Our state coordinators in every state had just received boxes and boxes of stickers, posters, flyers, bike tags, all using CommBank's own branding to call them out. And they were brainstorming the most creative actions they could think of. Then CommBank asked us for a meeting with our CEO, Kirsty. They'd asked us for quite a lot of meetings before, but this one was different. They called us in and they told us that they'd ended their relationship with Adani and they were not going to fund Carmichael Mine or Abbott Point. On the 5th of August, it was announced publicly to the media. CommBank had pulled out to a flood of media attention, making it almost impossible for Adani to secure any other financing. On the same day in the media, it was announced that the Mackay Conservation Group had won their court case in the federal court and had the approval for the Carmichael mine overturned because Greg Hunt, the Environment Minister, had failed to prove he had considered impacts on endangered species in the area. It was an incredible day for the movement. And we called it a campaign win, because that's what it is. 2 years ago, as I've said, I really didn't think that we could do it. But as our movement grew more powerful here and around the world, and as our bank's campaign progressed and attracted more volunteers than ever before, I started to understand that a win was not only possible, but likely. And then out of the blue, it happened. Unfortunately though, while it's important to take time to celebrate the wins that we achieve, the fight is far from over. We need assurance from the other 3 banks that they will not put any financing towards this project. If you're a customer of Westpac, NAB or ANZ, ask your bank what their policy is on this. There are also several important government decisions coming up, and in many ways, these are decisions that raise fundamental questions about our democracy. People often ask me, before and after we won, if the campaign was pointless. Why would any bank, they said, despite all environmental concerns aside, invest in a project that so clearly wasn't going to make a return on the investment as the coal price continues to plummet? In some ways, I think the answer is probably complicated, but in some ways it's very simple and it speaks volumes about our democracy. We know that our federal government is putting a lot of pressure on Australian banks to invest in this project, or at the very least, not speak out publicly about it. And we know that the fossil fuel industry still has a lot of money and a lot of power, and they're fighting our global movement with everything they have. And so, as I said, there are a number of key decisions on these projects that will be made by the federal and Queensland government in the coming weeks and months, and we have the opportunity to put pressure on our government around most of these. The Queensland government, as you may have seen in the media today, just released their 3rd dredging proposal for Abbott Point, because the public outcry around the first 2 clearly wasn't loud enough. And my understanding is that there'll be an open public submission period for this. the Wangan and Jagalingou people, the traditional owners of the Carmichael mine area, refused to negotiate with Adani when they came to them, saying that they do not want the mine on their land and they won't negotiate. Adani took them to the Native Title Tribunal and we're currently waiting on the result, after which the Queensland State Minister, Curtis Pitt, will decide whether or not to acquire their land on a 99-year lease and extinguish their native title rights. The W&J people are running their own campaign and I'd really encourage you to look it up and support them. The federal government also has to decide whether or not to use $300 million currently earmarked in the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund to use our taxpayer dollars to fund Abbott Point. So please keep an eye out for that one. And finally, Greg Hunt needs to reapprove the Carmichael mine site, and we expect this to happen within about 6 weeks. It's not clear whether or not there'll be a public submission period for this. It's not required. On top of reapproving the mine site, the government has come out swinging against environmental groups for using the legal system to sabotage important projects and calling it lawfare, otherwise known as using the rule of law or the legal system of our own country to prove that government ministers are not following the laws of their portfolios. And here's where I get to the situation highlighting questions about our democracy. The government has just announced that they're going to propose amendments to the EPBC, or the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, to prevent similar legal challenges being made in the future. Essentially what they've said is that they're changing the law to say that only someone directly affected by the development, that is a landholder, can challenge to the EPBC. What it is an attack on our rights as citizens to raise environmental concerns, and it leaves us with no way to stand up for areas or species of national significance if we're not a landholder in an affected area. It means that none of us have the right to protect the environment in our own country if we don't own that piece of environment. We need to call on the opposition, Greens and crossbenchers to block these changes in the Senate. Many of them have already said that they might do this, but we really need to make sure that these changes do not go through the Senate. It represents a fundamental decision from our politicians. Are they on the side of the people, or are they on the side of the coal industry? There's also, as you may have heard, and I think Jess is going to talk about this in more detail, currently an inquiry open into the tax-deductible charity status of environment groups like the AYCC and Greenpeace. And it's an attempt by the federal government and the Minerals Council to gut the budgets of environmental groups around the country. So I want to finish by saying this. Right now, I think we're facing into an important moment in history. People around the world are rallying towards the Paris climate talks at the end of the year, demanding more from their leaders. We're seeing communities around the world stand up against new coal mines and other fossil fuel developments, and trying to shut down existing mines and power plants. Divestment campaigns are gaining strength as bodies like the World Bank announce that they'll no longer fund new coal mines. The renewable energy revolution is well and truly taking off, whether or not our government likes it, and the rest of the world races ahead while Australia unfortunately falls behind. In the Netherlands, activists recently took their government to court and won for not taking strong enough action on climate change to protect its citizens. Even as our government makes outrageous statements about coal being good for humanity, we're seeing unprecedented public outcry in Australia to new coal proposals, new coal and coal seam gas proposals, such as the Warkworth mine in Bulga and the Shenhua mine in the Liverpool Plains. The Galilee Basin represents one key testing ground of this fight, and importantly, it's one that we're closer than ever to winning. Successfully keeping Galilee Basin coal in the ground would be a game changer in our fight against fossil fuels in Australia and around the world. Our movement is growing. We've come this far thanks to ordinary people around the country standing up in their hundreds of thousands and showing our governments, our banks, our companies that we are powerful, we are persistent, and we will not be stopped. We will not allow the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef and our climate for the interests of the few and the fossil fuel industry. We're fighting for our future, and our movement grows stronger every day as people around the world stand up and fight for climate justice. And the fossil fuel industry and their friends in high places, they know it. They fight back because they know it. They say that you're the closest to winning when you're also the closest to losing. And it looked like that for a long time in the Galilee Basin. But now I actually believe that we've tipped the scales firmly towards the winning side. I believe that we are going to win the Galilee Basin fight. But what makes me even more excited is that this is just the beginning of a much bigger movement. And around the world, I think that the power is finally tipping from the side of the fossil fuel industry to the side of the people. Thank you.